What I'm going to do today, I'm going to start out with a cut-rimmed bowl, meaning a regular functional bowl with a rim on it. And then I'm going to morph into a natural-edged open bowl. And if we have time before lunch, I'll do a second natural-edged open bowl, which I kind of like to do without talking, which cuts way down on the time that it takes to make it, of course. The idea being is to show you the versatility of this gouge that I have my name on, and how it works, how it differs from other types of gouges, and why I only travel basically with one tool to make open bowls and hollow forms. I have one other little detail gouge, which I think all you people already have, and that would be a 3/8 inch diameter spindle gouge. And I use it sparingly but effectively at the very end of the making process. You're welcome to take notes. You're welcome to ask, and hopefully ask questions as I'm going along, or question anything that I'm doing, because some of the cuts that I'm going to be making are contrary, if you wish, to the way we were all taught back in the 60s and 70s. And the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And some of them don't even appear in anybody's book but mine, so only those people who have read it know about them or have suffered through one of my workshops before. So let me get started on that. First of all, when I'm making a cut-rimmed bowl, let me explain fundamentally with all of my work in hollow forms or demonstration bowls like this, I don't go to the lathe with a specific design in mind. What I do instead is I go to the lathe with a specific piece in front of me, knowing that from that piece I can make a variety of different objects. And then I think about developing the shape and developing the form as I'm cutting away, learning from the material and responding to what I'm seeing. And that way, when I get done with the object, I then have my, quote, design, unquote. Because I have found from my style of work that if I go to the lathe with a specific design idea in mind, 99% of the time the material is not going to lend itself to that shape. And I'm in a toss-up there. Should I go with the shape or should I go with the material? And I think all of us run into that at some point or another. So I'm going to be developing this form, if you wish, and then I'll show you along the way what that refers to. You'll note, first of all, that I have put the tool rest, and I think this is critical, because I have grain going crosswise here, not end grain like a vase would be, but going crosswise. I put the tool rest at an acute angle to the object, and like about 30 degrees off perpendicular here. The reason is, I want to think about this object as like a spindle, like the handle of this gouge, meaning that if I'm whittling on this handle, I know to whittle this direction. I don't want to whittle that way because of experience from a kid. I know it's going to get stuck in the grain. So if you think about this as a big fat handle and do the same thing, line your tool rest up and you will naturally cut tangent to the fibers or obliquely to the fibers, and it'll go a lot better for you. In fact, if you do come in this direction like that, it'll tell you immediately it doesn't like it. So when that happens, just turn around, go the other direction. Listen to the material, in other words, and see what it'll do for you. Okay, let me get my shield up here, such as it is. I'll probably get an echo on myself inside of this cavity, but we'll see. So I start nibbling at the material, and at the same time tightening down the tailstock to keep pressure up against the spur, because it is green wood, and as I put drag on the material, that spur is going to want to continue to drive and fundamentally drill a hole in the end of there if I don't keep the pressure on. So this is the first of 5 cuts, 5 primary cuts that the gouge will do, which I affectionately call a roughing cut for obvious reasons. And it's generated by bringing the shaft in horizontal and then positioning a 45-degree angle across the flutes, the top of the flutes. And that puts the lower edge of the blade in an elevated position by virtue of where the bevel is pointing. So the bevel's pointing up, the edge is sitting on top of the bevel, and when the material comes down, in this case it gets stuck on the pencil, but of course when it's spinning it cuts the wood away, and that's what I'm after. Now it's a little hard to view it with the camera, but yeah, either way. This would be horizontal, and this is at a 45-degree angle, and this would be almost vertical, which I will use in a few minutes as a scraping cut. So what I want to do with this irregular piece of wood is to trim it down in a very safe manner by nibbling with the roughing cut out near the tip of the tool. Obviously, with a side grind tool, you do have the option of coming over here and working on the side, but you'll find out very quickly it's too much edge into the wood and it gets stuck and you get a big dig. So stick out with the tip. And let the tip do the work for you, so that you don't make too heavy a cut in the material when you're roughing it out like this. Another thing is, you'll notice I've got my hand at the back of the tool. This hand, of course, at the front of the tool, pressure down the tool rest, creating an equilateral triangle here with my torso. So I don't have to use a lot of muscle. In fact, I can usually just kind of covet the back end of the tool without really gripping it. And if you find with any tool that you're getting that death grip on it, set it aside like this, close your eyes, grip both front and back as hard as you possibly can, and then relax your hands and your shoulders. And then do it again. Grip it as tight as you possibly can, and then relax to nothing. And you'll find a certain spot that when you get back on the wood is all the muscle you need to hold the tool to do the job. And it'll help you prevent over gripping it while you're actually working on the wood. Then by the end of the day, you're not whipped, which you don't really want anyway. Okay, I've gotten rid of the rough stuff on there, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit and take that roughing cut here, drop the handle a little bit, and turn it into a slicer. Similar to what a conventional gouge would do, because I'm still out on the end of the tool. But a conventional gouge would need to be elevated to a certain degree to work anyway. So this has that same effect. Now we're working our way down to getting rid of this bark. In fact, because I'm on a little bit of bark here, let's see if we can get rid of that. Trim that bark off so it doesn't slip on the cambium layer, which looks like it's not going to be a problem, since it just pulled away from the wood. And now I don't know which hole I'm in. We'll try that one. Let's see if that's close. Yeah, that's close enough. For those of you who are not aware of this, you want to make certain that the centers, either the spur or this tailstock ball bearing center, is not resting on the bark, because the cambium layer can allow the bark to slip and you can lose the piece. It's not a lot of fun. Okay. Back with a slicing cut. I'm just kind of going with the material here. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on it. Understand too that the roughing cut's job is to get rid of the irregular surfaces on here, the points and the facets and things like that. But once you've done with that, the reason I go with a slicing cut is I use the slicer to shape the rest of the form. Roughing cut is fine, but it yanks fibers right out of the surface. And if you work with any of the spalted materials, which I do a lot, you'll find that you got basically the shape that you want, but you got a horrible surface in there because you spent too much time with the tool in the roughing position, and it's just ripped the soft fibers out of there. When you take an edge and you bring it to the surface like so, horizontally, you put an enormous amount of drag on the wood. And when you begin to raise that edge, you relieve some of that drag on the material until you get absolutely vertical, and then there's no drag at all, and of course, no cutting. So you have to back off a little bit to get some action going for you. But the idea is with each different material that you're working with, wet and dry and different species, and et cetera, try different angles, but elevate it above the horizontal, and you'll see an immediate difference in how it's treating the material. Clearly, it's an irregular surface. We'll fix that later. But it's not ripped out in the end grain in particular. So we'll trim some more of this bark off. In that particular cut, I'm not even gripping the back end of the tool. I'm just holding it in the notch of my thumb and first finger, so it'll give you an indication of how I'm trying to conserve my energy for later on in the process. Well, let's see what we got. Well, we're almost done with it. Let's take that pencil, and I'm going to look for the lowest facet on this surface, which will, of course, define the largest diameter of a hole that I can get out of the half log. So I can show you how I deal with these 8 corners and facets up here. But let me finish off this last little area down here. Get that sub-bark off of there. Now when I get to this pencil line, I'm going to, in order to get rid of those facets and those corners up there, I'm not going to go after them directly. I'm going to come in and sneak in behind them. So I'm going to cut straight up for a brief period on the surface, parallel with the belly delay, and then I'm going to pivot out and come in that direction, so which will be really oblique to those fibers. And then I'll come up again and out and up and out, and it just makes it easier to cut, and I can get rid of them very quickly. So here's the up cut, and then out, and up again, out, and up again. The whole point is that I can get rid of those corners without getting whacked by them. So I'm fundamentally down, with the exception of the little patches of bark on here, I'm down to a cylinder. Now it's at this stage when I have more information about this object than I have had so far, meaning that I can see where the pith was on this side and here. Let's see if they're kind of in line with one another. Yeah, they're really close. In fact, they're dead on. The point is that if there's any changes that I want to make in this piece before I attach it to a chuck or a glue block or a faceplate, this is when I want to make those changes, because I know a lot now that I didn't know before. Sure, I've still got a couple patches of bark on there, but I've got a pith and a pith on this side, of course, and it does happen to be running straight through the form. If it were on a kind of like a cattywampus going through here, I might want to bring it around by moving this area there in the tailstock point towards me, and that would straighten the pith out. Point being is that since the pith is somewhat near the rim of the finished bowl, I'd like it not to crack on one side because there's a pith in it. So I would adjust it, in other words, so that I wouldn't have that problem. And as it's distorting from the green to the dry, I might like to keep a sense of visual order to the piece. This would apply both to open bowls and especially to hollow forms where you might have the pith going straight through the form. If you mess around with the visual order, it's kind of like having a picture on the wall in your house and it's off by 1/8 of an inch, but you can see it a half a block away, kind of thing. It's disturbing, you know. So you go in and you make adjustments. Well, here I would be making the adjustment here. But I don't see a need to do it here in this particular situation. When we get to doing the natural edge bowls, we may make other adjustments on that as well. But I would make those adjustments only in the tailstock with the theory that I don't want to move the spur center because that would just then cut down on the total diameter of my form. Okay. So now, let's just finish trimming this out, then we'll flatten it out to receive the chuck. Take a spot on that in relation to the spur or the jaws of the chuck. Now I requested number 3 jaws on the chuck before I came, so that I could have. Oh, that looks perfect. Wonder how that happened. So that I could have real good substantial spigot on the bottom of these forms. We'll talk a little bit later about the relationship and the positives and negatives of using chucks, glue blocks, and faceplates. But when you are using chucks, particularly in softwoods and greenwoods, you don't want to use the little jaws that come with it, because with a tool like this, you're just going to snap this thing right out of the chuck every time, or almost every time. So what I do instead is I expand the diameter of the spigot accordingly with the jaws of the chuck, so I get a greater gripping power, larger surface area, but also so that I can design the foot of the bowl down inside the spigot if I'd like it to be. So even if I had a glue block or a faceplate on here, I still have to remove that amount of wood to get to this level. But there's no reason taking any more off if I don't need to. And in this case, what I'll do is make a spigot out here, and then the foot of the bowl can come right down inside the jaws, and the jaws are no longer an active part of influencing the design of the form. And when the jaws, when the chucks came out, first of all, in '86, I think it was, with the Nova Company in New Zealand, Dale and Ray Key, Dale Nish and Ray Key and I were over there doing a seminar in 3 different locations, and they came out with these chucks, and they were wondrous. And of course, then they came to the States through Craft Supplies, and they were even more wondrous, and everybody forgot about faceplates at that moment. What they also didn't realize was that they were allowing the jaws of the chuck to determine the shape of the feet and the location of the feet of their bowls. And everywhere I would go from then on for a decade, I'd see beautiful forms developing, you see, a natural edge and all this other stuff, and they all had the same foot, same diameter of foot. It was all determined because you didn't want to cut into the jaws. So my point being is that as I do this, I'll show you how I get past that problem. Let me now shape that. I could use the skew on its side, but in this case I'm going to use that detail gouge I described earlier. Let me make a preliminary cut with the bigger gouge. Actually, I think I noticed this a little bit earlier. I've hit something in the bark which is stalling me out here, so let me go sharpen this puppy up. So let's do a preliminary cut with the bigger gouge up about 3/8 of an inch, and then I'll finish it off to a dovetail shape for the Vic Mark stuff, and then trim it back down here so it's real accurate down in there. Now, let me again go back to basics in relation to chucks. Can I get a spot on this chuck with the camera, please?
You want it right down overhead?
Yeah, anywhere here that I can show folks.
You're good.
This may sound like you already, I'm sure most of you already know this, but I think it's really critical to understand the importance of how to shape that spigot. In effect, I want this surface here to butt up against that surface there flush. I want this edge here to make a solid contact down in that notch, so I can't have any sloppiness down in there. And I want to make certain that this surface here of the jaws never touches this surface here, because then I wouldn't get the jaws all the way onto the spigot. It's not bad to use a skew or take one of those, what do they call it, a diamond-pointed scraping tool? Is that what the way they term it? Anyway, it's something like that, and sharpen it to that particular angle and just poke it in and you're done. It would be so. Anyway, that's taken care of. So I can now trim this stem down, making sure, here's the last thing, the fourth thing, making sure the diameter, if I'm going to keep this on here, making sure that diameter doesn't get down inside the jaws of the chuck, such that if you crunch the jaws down, it collapses on this instead of on the spigot. It's very easy to overlook that. And the last thing, of course, is I want to make sure this is a dead flat surface. And for that, I do the third primary cut. We've talked about the roughing cut, the slicing cut. This is the scraping cut. And it's the first of 2 times that you actually use the blade on the side of the gouge. And in order to do that, you have to drop it so it's almost vertical, meaning that the flute is almost vertical, the line across the flute. In fact, the top edge of the gouge is only about 1/16 of an inch away from the surface of the wood. It wouldn't hurt it if you touched it, because the wood would be going away from that top edge, but you don't need to touch it. It's not going to do anything. But that's your basic scraping cut, and the value of it is not only to prevent it from touching here, but also to line it up such that you could put a glue block on there if you wanted to, or you could attach a faceplate without its rocking and rolling. Usually it's this spot right down in here where you have the most difficulty, because it's kind of hard to get at. You want to make sure that you do get at it. There we go. That should be fine. See how we did here. Ooh, goody. I don't know if it's necessary, but I tighten the chuck on both sides. Makes me feel better at least. And I've got a little bit of air gap in there. Let me see if it's not binding here. Huh. It's all the way on there. Well, it'll hold. Always bring the tailstock back into position for support. Safety, obviously. You can't lose the piece because you now got it trapped between these 2 masses, but also whether it's wet or dry wood, doesn't matter. You've just eliminated the potential for any vibration on here when you start making your finishing cuts. When I go back with a shear scraping cut, if I have a large object or a large diameter object, I have to have the tailstock on here. Or when I make my backward slicing and backward shear scraping cut to get ready for sanding, it'll just sit there and vibrate on the wood. Especially if it's a vase form, which is sticking way out here, but smaller in diameter. So Now I need to begin to define things. The first thing I want to define is the upper plane on here, or surface, which will become the rim of the form. So let me trim that down. Secondly, I'll come down here and define the lower quadrant as to where this curve is going to go later on down into the interior of the chuck. So for the foot. So let me knock this down using the tip of the tool in the slicing position. And just nibble at it once again. Another thing that can happen, particularly with birches, and you have a lot of river birch around here, and maple, and I guess this is a black maple that I had never heard of before, but another thing that can happen, very common in their growth, is that you'll get branches that are immature that break off, and they trap, while they were still active and young, they trap little particles of dust in the crotch of the branch on the side of the trunk. And you don't see it. And so I always look for it in these species, little immature branches, and there's one right here. And if there's any gray area surrounding that, that's dust. And that's what's going to take your edge off. So if you see it, just be aware that it's there. Yeah. And let me go a little farther. I'm right on the pith across the face of this. So let me take it down another quarter of an inch. Yeah, there's something knocking my edge off of this thing already. Another thing that occurred to me, when I started out, I made mention of the fact in the roughing cut I was holding the gouge at the back of the handle. Now what I've done is I slid my hand up here for my slicing cut and put the handle up against my hip so that I can move. Basically, all the energy for this cut is coming through my torso. It's not coming from my shoulders. From my waist up, I'm a fixed unit. I'm just, holding and supporting the tool. So I've spread my legs, my feet out, and I've unlocked my knees so that I can move through my legs, and everything is happening again. And I'll do this more and more and illustrate it for you as I go. From the body. So my energy is coming from my chi. It's coming right out of my abdomen here. It's not coming out of my shoulders, and I'm not out here like this. That's critical, because you don't have any control over the cutting action of the tool. All right, now let me trim off this extra section of bark here and here. Slicing cut again. Just a simple slicing cut. Almost got rid of it all.
You got dirty lines on your cans.
Yeah, we got a
Pretty wet wood.
Look at that screen.
You can see my face shield. I can hardly see the piece of
We're
wood.
lucky that screen's there. You guys in the front row would be
Yeah.
wearing raincoats. Yeah, Gallagher.
It'd be sweet though, sugar man. Yeah.
We did have a fellow that showed up with a plexiglass shield in the front row. He lasted about 5 minutes and then he gave up the ghost.
Generally, what speed are you turning at?
Well, let's look at it, because I do have a unit here, probably around 700 or 800 would be okay. I mean, I'm secure, I'm round, I'm not off weight. You see, it's not a natural edge bowl that might cause it to be heavier on one side than the other. Let's see what this is. Well, that's not going to get me very far. That's 800 there, 950. That's pretty good. Doesn't have to be, you don't have, you're not in a race or anything. It'll go. Now I'm going to do what I call a base cut. I don't know anything else to call it. Just knocking the edge off. There's something in this here. base cut, very simple. Here it is. I made a mess over here.
Buried all your tools.
Yeah. What I've done is to create this notch here. And the reason is, when it's spinning, I can see obviously the silhouette of this curve. I want to be able to follow that curve down and envision it going through this step and down inside the spigot later on to create the foot. And in order to do that, I've got to miss the inner edge of the jaws of the chuck. If I don't miss that, what will happen is the outside surface of the form will come down, and then it'll have a ring around it, and it'll continue on for the bottom of the thing. And it doesn't appear in any of the other turning books. I don't know why it doesn't, but it's a very simple procedure. I think the reason is, at least for my students, they're a little hesitant to cut the wood away. It's like it's such a precious material, especially if you've paid money for it, that you don't want to cut the wood away in this area because you're afraid you're going to waste something out of it. But in fact, what you're doing is you're increasing the opportunity to use the entire height of the block that you have to begin with by giving yourself the freedom. Now, clearly, we're not in a situation here where we can form the foot right away. You know, there's the procedure that so many people go through. They drill a hole in the front of the block, put a single screw faceplate or screw chuck on there, turn the outside of the form and put a foot on it, and then grab that foot with the chuck, and now you're in this situation here. The main problem with that is the moment you drill that hole in the front, you align the grain in your object to the hole. And it's never where you want it. It may be close, but it's not under control. So here, not only am I under control of the grain by realigning the pith if necessary, but I'm also saving the foot for the last part of the finished bowl rather than the first part, because that gives me, just a second, that gives me the opportunity to make a larger diameter spigot, a larger diameter faceplate, or whatever it is, and then I've got all the freedom I want of working down inside there. If I have a small spigot on there, I can't turn a big piece without losing it. So I limit the scale of the work that I am working on just because I've got a small jawed chuck on my hands. Yes, sir.
Well, I use a screw chuck. How does that problem with using a screw chuck and aligning the grain present itself?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me illustrate it on the board here. Let's say you have a block in cross-section looks like this, and you drill a hole in here, like so, and you attach your screw chuck like yay. All right. That hole is a reflection of this surface here, correct? Because I assume you're on a drill press or something like that. All right. What if your grain is running through this way and you want it to go through this way? You're stuck. You're stuck. But if you take the same block and you put it between centers and turn it to a cylinder and then realign it so that the spur center is touching here and the tailstock center is touching here, yes, you'll cut more off of here and here than you will there and there, and you'll realign the piece, and you may lose 1/8 of an inch of it, but you'll get the grain going right where you want it because you can trace it from one side to the other in the same way I trace the pith from one side to the other. So take that same block, you see, and then put your spigot on it, like I have just done, put it into the chuck, and you bypass this step right away. And that's my only objection to it, is that it limits your design of potential rather than increasing your design potential.
Okay.
Okay?
Want to clean that mess?
Oh, thanks.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What is the objection to having your grains run askew rather than, say, parallel?
Actually, none. In fact, I've done a lot of pieces, spherical forms specifically, where I have the grain running diagonally through the form. And after the sphere dries, from the green to the dry, it goes like this. It stretches out like any bowl would, and you have this kind of an oval form now instead of a perfect sphere. And the hole of the entrance of my piece is no longer above the foot, because I'm playing with the grain in order to get the kind of design I want out of the piece. It's the ones that are kind of serendipitously set up, where maybe you have a natural edge bowl, But there's a section over here on the right which was cut with the gouge or the scraper or something as you were making it, and the rest of it was natural edge. And it's like putting two different design ideas in the same thing. It generally does not work. But if you want to have control of the grain, the way to do it is to start out between centers rather than drilling a hole, which would give you, you might get it right, maybe, but almost never, unless you're able to measure some way that original flat surface is perpendicular to the grain. That would be tough. You'd be there with your electric hand plane trying to work it down. So I think, in other words, it's just limiting, very limiting to your ability to grow as you're developing the work over time. Does that help? Okay. Now let me illustrate first. I don't know if you can see this at the moment, but I'm going to point it out anyway. There are chipped fibers on this form here and here, and it's where the tool has come up on the curve and met the end grain fibers on opposing sides and just turned those things backwards. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to finish this surface shaping the bowl with a backwards slicing cut and get rid of those, and then a backward shear scraping cut to prepare it for sanding. I'll explain why in a moment, but let me get an edge on the tool first and actually do it. So my normal slicing cut, as I did it before, starts here and comes up here like this. Now I'm going to take the same cut, but I'm going to go backwards a little bit. Let me stop there and make sure it's doing what I want it to do. Okay, need to go a little deeper is all. And once again, you can see by bringing my wrist into my tummy, unlocking my knees, and spreading my feet out. This is a pretty tall lathe even for me. I'm able to move through the cut like this, but using this again in my energy source rather than my hands, wrists, and shoulders. All right, now I'll go back over with the shear scraping cut in a minute and finish that off. But the reason I'm going backwards is that when I come in the standard way, when you come from the foot to the rim, like yay, because the blade is on an angle rather than horizontal, because it's on an angle, where the center part of the blade is doing the work, the last part of the blade to touch the wood is the high side. And as the center part of the blade goes past the material, that high side is lingering out there, and it just grabs the fibers and folds them or chips them out. Because it's dragging on the wood, basically. There's no pressure against the wood, so to speak. The center part is the only part that has the pressure. But if I go backwards like this, with the angle of the blade, again, coming at a 30, 40 degree angle, something like that, the center part is still doing the work, but the lower side of the blade is the last part to touch the wood, and all it does is leave the surface, and there's nothing there to drag on those fibers and pull them up. So it takes them right out. So when you work with ash material in particular, with a real hard winter and soft spring and summer grain, you'll pull those soft summer grain fibers right out and have big chunks out of the side of your piece, and this will clear it up right away. It's a wonderful cut to learn. So now let me go back here with the shear scraping cut and finish that off. And that's basically the slicing cut taken even higher and then closed down. Now the shear scraping cut, as you understand, is a combination of a scraping cut, which would be coming at the wood horizontally, and then raising the blade up at a very high 40 to 45 degree angle if possible, and that's where you add the shear. And once again, by going downwards with the form, it's the last part of the blade to touch the wood is the low side, and it simply leaves the surface, so you're not tearing anything up. And it was actually Del Stubbs that came up with that term, shear scraping, when he was doing his thin platters with a wet paper towel on the outside, you know, and he'd turn the scraper down inside the bowl, and then he'd turn it on an angle like that and pull this direction here up. He's actually, with these wafer-thin objects, he was actually pushing against the wet paper towel, and the wetness of the paper towel was keeping the wood from drying out and chipping on it when he was doing that. But he called it a shear scraping cut. So, all right, let me then go to the rim here. And I think in this case, we'll just kind of put a rolled rim on it because it's sharp at the moment. But even if we did do a sharp rim on it, I can show you with the shear scraping cut that if I just barely touch that rim, now I can touch that without fear of cutting myself. Because I've just taken the crispness, the sharp edge off of that, and left the crispness, rather, of the edge. But let me use some more of those shear scraping cuts. Real high this time. The reason, again, is that I want to reduce the drag of the edge against the wood. And you don't want to go after it like a gouge. It'll, take a big dig out of that rim. But I can make a very delicate cut on here using a very high shear scraping cut. And that'll give me the shape that I want, whatever that shape is that particular day. This is also good, a real good cut to make if you've already thinned something out and for some reason there's a flaw of some kind in that rim, and you know if you're going to go back to it, you're going to blow the bowl up. But if you come at it with a real high shear scraping cut, you reduce the drag so much of the blade to the wood that you can barely touch the wood and work down past that flaw, whether it's a chip or a check or whatever it might be. Okay. Now, any thoughts before we go down inside? Yes, sir.
I have a question about, your technique uses a lot of pull cut.
Uh-huh.
And some turners are proponents of the push cut
Right.
of the final.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what the
Sure.
advantages and disadvantages?
The push cut came from the traditional British style of turning, where the edge of the gouge is on the end of the shaft only, not swept around the side. And it's the only way the gouge would function, really. You ride the bevel, you enter the bevel, then the edge, and then you push forward, which is basically what I'm going to do on the inside of the bowl. But when we started working with the swept back edge on it, which was Liam O'Neill and Ray Key and Raff and Richard working, all experimenting in their own styles in the early 80s. And Mick O'Donnell, too, up in Scotland, although his was quite pointed on the tip of it. Liam's was great. It was sharpened about 2 inches back from the edge, from the tip of the tool, and he used it both as a scraper and as a gouge cutter because it's a production turn. You got move a lot of wood in a hurry. And he used to bring the gouges over without handles. They were Sorby gouges, and he'd sell them to Highland Hardware in Atlanta. And people would buy them. And by the time they got to my classes, they'd sharpened them the full length of the flute down there. You couldn't even hold on to the thing. It was like the American way, the bigger the better. And but when I go in with my gouge with a swept back edge, you have new potential now that you don't have with a traditional bowl gouge shape or tip, and that is you do have that slicing cut. And we learn by going back and forth as to which one works the best. And that's where I came up with this idea of going backwards with the shear scraping cut. If I go forwards on it, I kept getting these chipped fibers out of there. And I couldn't figure out what the heck the problem was. And one day I kind of got lazy with myself, and I'm going backwards and forwards, and I left the wood by going the wrong direction and went and sharpened my tool and came back and they were gone. I'm saying, Eureka, where's this coming from? So I figured out why it was actually happening. And it was because of the height of the blade and the lower part of the blade doing it. But that pulling cut with the side of the tool, and I'll show you on several occasions today, allows me to get in and draw and pull the body. It's like you grab anything from a distance and you pull it like this, you pick up support for it. You push away from it, you lose support for that object, including a face shield. And so that's the idea. If I'm working on a big bowl and I'm pushing away from myself, the last 2/3 of that cut, I'm off balance in most cases. But if I take it instead with this pulling cut and start at the bottom and work up like that, I gain balance because I'm coming to my central axis of my torso as I move into the end of the cut. Does that help?
Yeah, I've just watched people like Len Lucas, who
Yeah.
really does both.
Yeah.
He roughs everything out with a swept back gouge, and then he finishes his interior and exterior cuts with a push cut.
Right.
Which he's a crackerjack at, but,
Yeah. Riding the bevel.
Yes.
Well, look where he came from.
yeah.
You know, the impact of the British turners on us. I mean, I remember when I came into turning in 72 or 73 and discovered there were other turners around. I also discovered there was a huge fight between the scrapers and the gougers. They didn't talk with one another. And in many cases, in the right places, meaning on the other side of the pond, they're still not talking with each other. So that doesn't answer your question. But you, try it both, and I will show you the other side of that coin now, because I'll be doing both on the interior. Well, actually, I won't be doing any pull cuts, but I will be doing some pushing cuts. And it's just that with the change of design and new approaches to the wear and tear on the body, we've had to learn new ways of doing things. And that's why when I started out, there were small handles and they were fat. And I did the same thing with my hollow tooling, my bend tools. I was beating myself up, trying to think I was muscular, and that's all I had to work with. And then later on, I suddenly realized, oh man, a longer handle, this feels really good. So I started thinking about triangles, of course. So it's from the feet to the abdomen, it's from the chest to the cavity to the hands, and going through all these interlocking triangles. And the way you move also has a critical factor in terms of not only the ability to make good cuts, but also the opportunity to remain sane by the end of the day, so you're not beat up, and you're trying to make your most critical cuts and you're the most fatigued. That's when it really shows. Okay, I'm a little low with that tool rest. Let me just check the chuck also, because, yeah, I've got a little movement in there from the green wood, not much. And push it, there we go. So I'm going to start out in the manner in which one would expect, working with a roughing cut from the left of center towards center, left of center towards center, and I'll get rid of this hub right away, and then work my way successively out to the perimeter of the form. Now I'm up to 1150, if that helps anybody. It's more than enough speed. So here's my roughing cut again, the way I started out on the outside, meaning tools horizontal, 45 degrees across here. Handle way out here so that I'm touching only the blade to the wood, not the bevel. Because I don't care what the quality of the surface is right now, I just want to get rid of the raw stuff. Okay, that's a great indication. Let me turn this down. I want to show you what happens when you get to the rim of your bowl and you're making the final cut on the rim and bam, it backs up on you and wipes out the rim. Anybody ever done that? No. Okay. Do you know why? Yeah, that's the important thing. Let me get some lubrication here.
Experience.
Well, the real problem is if you don't know why, you go back and do more of it. You know, you just pretty soon your bowl reduces by an inch.
Take this.
Okay, let me just illustrate here. Let's speed it up a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to hold it here the way you would if you're entering into the rim, flute on the right-hand side, pointing in the direction of the cut, and just touch it to the wood. You see it go to the left? All right, now I'm going to reverse that. Turn it to the left with the gouge flute pointed to my left. And it immediately kicks to the right. Same thing. Touch it, and it goes. Turn it this way, and it moves. That's what's wiping out your rim. In effect, let me get that pencil back over here. When you come in for your final cut, the chances are really good that the handle and the gouge is pointed somewhere out here instead of over here. With the end result that the material comes down, the first thing it hits on that tip is the left-hand side of the radius of the end of the tool, which is actually elevated. You want to be on the lower right-hand side, which is, again, lower down below, so that it actually enters the way you want it to. So what happens is you touch that thing like that, and bingo, it zams to the left and wipes out your rim. But if you had only come a little bit more this direction, then the wood would hit on the tip, but also the right-hand side of the tip, which is the low side of the radius on the end, and you never have that problem again. Okay? So let's speed it back up, and that was what was happening to me when I was pushing forward. I was allowing the left-hand side to touch the wood simultaneously, and that's what made it kick to the back, to the left. So I'll bring it farther out. You can do this on the thinnest of bowls. Right there. Just make sure that left-hand side of the radius of the tip doesn't touch the wood. Right there, I got a stuff going on like that. It's an aggressive cut, but what the reason is causing that is that the edge of the gouge is hitting that stem, which is, 3/8 of an inch high, which is about 95% end grain. So it's hitting it twice with each revolution right on the end grain, and it's bucking it like that. So in order to prevent that from happening, just slow the cut down or take several cuts to make the same thing instead of one more aggressive, larger cut. But I just kind of go with the flow. I don't mind if it's bucking up and down. It's not going to go anywhere. It'll still get rid of the wood. So here, I'm pushing forward again with the tool, and in order to help stabilize the edge going through the material as I rough it out, I'm also touching the bevel on the left. So I'm pushing against the bevel and then pulling the handle and caroming the edge basically off the bevel as I go around, which would be the classic manner of turning a bowl. Especially if you're working on deeper bowls, it's really important to marry that bevel on there and push against the bevel to stabilize that edge, because the farther you go into the bowl, the farther you are off the surface of the tool rest to support. So it makes real sense to stick on the bevel when you're doing this. Let's take this and stages down here. Okay, now, let me cruise around that rim with the lower right-hand side of the tip of the blade at the tip. Then bring it around like this on the bevel and undercut it just slightly. I'll finish that off in a minute, but I want to resharpen. Anytime I go for a finishing cut, I always resharpen the tool, whether it needs it or not, just to make sure I've got all my ducks lined up for me. Also want to bring the tool rest in farther for better support. I always keep the tool rest tip about 1.5 inches minimum beyond the center line of the bowl, because if you're taking some heavier cuts on a soft or even a hardwood, you can break that stem off, and because you're pushing, that tip will go over to the right and can fall off the end of the tool rest, which is not a lot of fun. And so that's always a good plan when you're working down on the inside. Keep it to the right so that you don't have any accidents occurring there. All right, let me give this a minute. All right, so let's get back on the bevel in the roughing position and clear out some more of this mass.
You got a new design going on here.
Yeah, really.
We'll put a series of screens up here, so. Oh, that's good. Oh, this is good. If you happen to have one of these things, if you want to really stabilize it, plug one end of it with tape, fill it full of lead shot and epoxy, and it'll dampen it up and really make it solid. Right now, it's just a very thin wall on there, and it can actually vibrate on the wheel. Or the wheel can bucket around a little bit, see, but if you put some mass behind it, then it's really nice. So we'll work with that in a minute. All right, what I'm going to do now is go in with a finishing cut. And this is the one that's really kind of strange, because for the first time, I'm going to be writing the bevel as a requirement of making a successful cut, but I'm also going to do it on the wrong side of the tip. And the reason is, if I come on the correct side of the tip, or at least correct to the traditions, where I'm a 45-degree angle here, and I'm cutting on the end and around to this side of the tip, I've actually got the edge of the blade on an angle to the wood, and it causes me to plow forward in order to make that cut. It'd be better if I could have the material come right down straight on top of the edge, so that the edge is pointing up and the material's coming down. I get a much clearer or somewhat clearer cut on the wood itself, which obviously is going to result in less sanding internally. So what I do is I've got the sharpening jig set up so that it sticks that bevel out, projects the bevel out from the edge at a certain angle that I can touch the bevel on the wood when the tool's horizontal and nothing will happen. It only engages the wood when I bring the gouge over like this, and then I get a little bit of the tip touching the edge of the gouge touching the wood. That's what I want, supported by the bevel. And at that spot, that's when the wood is coming directly down on top of that edge. So all I need to do is to ride that bevel all the way down like this to the end at the center of the bowl, and I should be done. In order to do that, I have to remember one thing in particular. Never turn the gouge to the left of horizontal, not even 1 degree. Because when it catches, it feeds it in a nanosecond, and then you get to start another bowl. Because you got a full 7/8 of an inch of blade there, it's just going to take a whoop right out of the side of the thing. So imagine you've got a bubble level on here, and you keep the bubble in the crosshairs, and you're fine. Next thing is, I put the end, when you get to the end, you get nervous, of course, because you're fishing for it. And a lot of times, if you have a gouge that has a very narrow radius at the bottom of the tool, at the bottom of the flute rather, when you get to there, you can't find it, especially with a dirty face shield. So you fish for it, and the next thing you know, you've got a little divot in the bottom of your bowl. Now you've got to recut the whole thing to get to the bottom of that divot. So what I do is I set the bevel on the gouge on the wood like that at the end of the cut. Then I get my feet set up so that I feel comfortable, equal left and right of that spot. And when I'm there, it turns out that the line between that tip and my navel will be 90 degrees to the line of my feet. And when that happens, when I come down here like this, I start the cut here, I'm vertical over my right leg. When I end the cut up here, I'm vertical and balance over both legs, which I call the apex of my comfort zone. So if I'm comfortable when I get there, there's no reason I should be nervous about making that fluid cut right through the nib. In fact, if you think of the nib as just one more spot on all the spots that you've already cut through, there's no reason to treat it any differently than you did in the process of getting there. So I stay on the bevel and just glide through the nib and it's gone, and I don't have any interruptions to that surface. At least that's the plan. So let me get on the bevel, bring the gouge around here like this, supported by the bevel, get the edge to engage the wood, and start to cut. If I get into thicker material, I simply rotate it to the right a little bit, like an eighth of a turn. Now I'm back in my roughing cut. Plow that stuff out of my way in the roughing position and end up in the middle. Come back on the bevel, feed it forward till I get to the thicker material. There it is. Okay, now I want you to notice also my left hand. I'm not gripping the gouge. In other words, I'm not here. This is the worst, when your thumb is underneath it. When your thumb's underneath that thing, you put so much tension in this hand, your knees will lock up. But if you bring your thumb up here like that, your knees will automatically weaken, and you can now move from here to here, which is the biggest problem we all have, is moving from one location to another with some sense of fluidity to that movement, okay? So the idea is, when you're doing this, consciously think about bringing your thumb up, take your hand away from the rim, set it back here, open your fingers. In other words, just lay your hand on top of the tool. That's all this hand is supposed to do anyway, is hold that gouge grounded to the tool rest and let this hand do the work. And eventually, let me see what kind of wall thickness I have left here. Maybe. You can get the cut started. Feel the curvature of the form with the bevel. Let it start the cut. Just take that hand off. Okay, now I don't see it starting to vibrate on the wood. I don't have enough pressure down with this particular material to do that. But theoretically, with this thumb over here pushing down, you should be able to get enough pressure on it to hold the cut. But it would have to be in a less dense material. So let me start that over again. Each time, riding that bevel right down to the center and then through the mill.
David,
Yeah.
point on that end of that tool where you're cutting.
Hold on here. Let me get. Okay. Let me
You're
pull
not
this.
cutting on the end of that tool. because
No,
you'd
I'm
be
cutting
pushing.
on just about an eighth of an inch to the left of the tip.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
Right there. See, here's the end of the tip, and I've shifted over to just a little bit of the left-hand side, about a 16th to an eighth of an inch. But I'm on the bevel now. I could start out on the right-hand side and then shift over like this just by turning the gouge from this position to this position. From the 45 across here to the, I'm not used to the delay of that picture to the movement. It's really
Yeah, they don't see it.
They don't
Just
see
that
it.
long.
It's on
Okay.
it, yeah.
Yeah, to this horizontal. But when I'm horizontal, once again, if the bevel's touching the wood and I bring the edge around, I can only touch that little bit to the wood itself. I don't want to be out here because then I won't be on the bevel. And that would cause problems. You know, it's not uncommon to kind of work the material away like this with the tip of the tool. You don't want to make a big cut because it'll feed in and want to jam on you. But if you're on the bevel, you can just roll right through it. Let me just measure my depth here and see what I have left. Maybe I'll have the opportunity to go through this thing, but I think I got about a 1/16 of an inch left. That ought to be enough.
Tell me before you do, so we have
Sounds
the
a little
camera ready.
thin, though.
Photos,
Well, I kinda
photos,
got-
so.
It's what we call happy cutting. You know? Once you get started, you can't stop. What was I thinking about earlier in terms of that? Well, we'll get to it, because we'll be able to do this on a couple of other bowls also. So let me then, okay, now the curvature of the inside is obviously going to determine, once I have the outside measured, where the location of the foot is and how deep I can go for that foot. Right now, I know that foot's going to be down in the spigot, because I've got about a 1/16 of an inch left to go. So let me pop this off here. Yeah. And, you know, another way of roughing that out that I enjoy watching is what Rupert Graffin has. He's got almost like a square scraper, and he just plunges straight in, going 90 degrees to the fibers, and he leaves a stepped interior surface, which he then goes back with the gouge and cleans up. That's another way of doing it. Yeah.
Oftentimes I get washboarding when I'm trying to finish up that last cut from
Oh, yeah.
going into the bowl. I get what I call washboarding.
It's like a propeller down in the bottom.
Right, well, not in the bottom, it's on the outside edge, out towards the end of the bowl.
You mean out here near the rim?
Yes. Maybe the washboarding appears maybe a quarter of an inch inside of that.
Inside?
And then it goes for maybe about a half an inch.
And then does it disappear?
Then it disappears.
That's odd, because usually when you get vibration started, if you're on the bevel, it'll increase the vibration the deeper you go. That's why I backed off and did it again, and you have to go back and pick it up. There's got to be a lack of support there somewhere,
Right.
and you'll just have to figure out where it is. It could be, I mean, what kind of a lathe are you working on?
Same thing.
Same thing, yeah, this is a good lathe. It wouldn't be the material. Resharpen your tool, make sure when you go into the initial cutting part that the tool is turned to the right in the 45-degree angle across, so that you're on the tip and the right-hand side. And as you go forward, you will automatically be on the bevel to support that cut. Take it real slow, push the bevel against the wood as you progress forward with it. It should take it out. Now, if it's a very thin object, then obviously there's a potential for it to vibrate away from the bevel of the tool. So that could cause a problem too. But it's almost a circumstantial thing. You'd have to see it happening in order to try and figure out what the real problem is.
Is there an advantage to cutting down an inch at a time as you're going down?
That's a tough one.
Supported.
That's a tough one, because I know people that swear that's the only way you can make a bowl. It's kind of silly if you think about it. There's certainly more than one way to make a bowl. But in dry wood, when you're working in dry wood, you're not going to get the amount of distortion that you're going to get in green wood. If you go with green wood down there, you get down 1.5 inches and then stop, and then rough out some more. By the time you go back to that in a thinner material, it's going to be distorted all automatically. So that's why I like to work the whole surface down. And I'm thinking of this surface as that surface, not just this surface or that surface or little portions of it. I'm thinking about the whole surface. That's why I spread my feet out and unlock my knees, so I can make that finishing cut as a full run down there, as opposed to taking it in stages. It's my style, true, and I only work with green wood, because if I did demonstrations in dry wood, we'd be here all day making one bowl. Harder to cut. But there are obviously more ways than one. Yes, sir?
When I've had problems early on with getting that ridging, either inside or outside, I found I was being too dominant with my left hand, and I'm putting too much pressure
On the tool rest?
Well, actually, I'm pushing the bevel into the side of the wood, or the inside or outside, with
Yeah.
my left hand, which is causing it to bounce.
Okay, because you're hitting the end grain twice with each revolution. That would be correct.
If you lighten up on that left hand and just do what you said, just let it sit on top, that goes away. way.
That's a good point. It brings up another thing. When I'm doing the shear scraping cut on the outside of the bowl for my finishing cut prior to sanding, about 95% of my pressure is down into the tool rest and a very small amount up against the wood for that very reason. If you're pushing up against the grain with a very finite cutter, which is what the shear scraping is, then you're going to get bouncing on the end grain or knots or anything else. I don't want that. I want to ground the tool rest and then glide down, considering the whole surface, and work the whole surface a little bit at a time, you see. So I'm actually stroking it with the blade or the edge, not the bevel. Anyway, there's no bevel in that cut. And it'll slice because of the angle of the edge so high in the wood, it'll slice right through the end grain without bouncing on it, or a knot or something like that, or the wings of a natural edge bowl. But if I push against it, immediately I'll start that bounce. So, good point. Okay, let's see if we can't, yeah, that too. I'm going to use a little foam rubber on here and just use the chuck as a jam chuck. If you're not familiar with it, this is a new tailstock, ball bearing tailstock center that Robust has come out with that has a set screw so you can remove the point and extend it to different lengths out, or turn it backwards and put just a blunt if you want it for pens and things. It's got the threaded element for the cup if you want that, and it's got two bearings in here, so it's really a sound device. But it is a new product for them, which I guess was an advertisement, but I don't sell them. All right, I'm going to use the same hole as before. At some point, I'll do one that doesn't have a stem on here, and I'll show you how I get that recentered on there, probably on the hollow form this afternoon. Okay, so that should be pretty good. Now, my interior is within 1/16 of an inch of this surface, so I know this surface is going to be my foot, just because I got a little happy cutting that says that. So I'm going to cut this down, cut these two steps down until this surface here, the curve of that surface meets this surface down here, and then I'll know that's my foot. So I don't plan my foot ahead of time. I just give myself room by making that base cut so that I can have a foot. And sometimes you want a larger diameter foot for a functional object, and sometimes you don't. It doesn't matter if it's a non-utilitarian object. Like,
Do you like to cut them that close every time?
no, I don't. I just blew it, you know.
Demos only, right?
I was having too much fun. All right, well, let's see what we got for an edge here. So I'll use the slicing cut. I am under pressure here, so I don't want to put a heavy cut onto this. So that's why I'll use the slicing cut to reduce the drag of the edge in the wood. And when I do the natural edge bowl, we'll do some pencil lines on there, and I'll show you how I accommodate to the thickness of the form. Okay, now I'm going to come backwards with a shear scraping cut to integrate the old surface with the new surface. We put a little radius on there. And because we did a soft rim out here, we'll just put a little soft element on that foot. Kind of get a little radius also, just for the fun of it. All done with the blade, no bevel. But in that slicing or shear scraping position. Now, one other thing, especially in the hollow forms, is that this surface and the new surface that I just cut don't line up because of the distortion in the upper form. So if you turn the speed of the lathe down to about 100 RPM, and you put, using the shear scraping cut, you put the gouge up against the wood like this, and instead of holding it with two hands, just hold it with one hand, and the back of the gouge handle is now against my hip. Because I don't want to overcut the upper part. If I have two hands here, I'll be tempted to recut the upper surface, which I don't want to do. And I just lay the blade up against the old surface, and as I do that, you'll see it's going woo, 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 like that, keeping contact all the way around the irregularities of that surface. And as I go forward in the shear scraping position, it'll take that step and ferret out. And then I can sand the rest of the way and clean it up. So I'll put the gouge here and go forward through the threshold between the old and the new. And it takes that little hump right out. And it doesn't look like a great surface because it's torn up again up here where I did that other cut. I did come this direction with that slicing cut, and sure enough, I got a couple of digs out of this side, and probably, no, this one isn't so bad. So this one, you could then sand that out. It would take a little bit with 180 grit probably, or maybe even 150 to get it down to where we want it. But we'll do a better job when we do the natural edge bowls later on here in a minute. In fact, then once I'm down to that spot, I would ordinarily take my detail gouge and make an undercut on here. But I don't think I got enough wood in there to make an undercut, or at least not much of one. So we'll definitely trim that stem down. Man, I hit something in this material before. Much nicer. So then we'll get on the bevel and just run that edge straight forward. Taper the stem down again. Get on the bevel and take it straight forward. And once again, taper that stem down. A fairly small point, about 1/8 of an inch or less. And turn the lathe off, get on the bevel, turn the lathe off, and just send this forward and cut that stem right away. And you have a little bowl with there. Look. Yeah. Poor job, David. Oh well. We'll do better the second time around. In fact, it's also already grown. Oh, there's a little high spot right in the center that it's riding on. So we basically did everything wrong, even though we got through it. So we'll do a nicer one with the natural edge form after this. I would suggest on this, save these little things, by the way. Throw them in a trash can. Don't leave them on the floor mixed with the other shavings, because when you find them, you won't like them. Let me bring this little detail gouge over here so you can maybe get a shot of it. And I'll come to you.
You want to go over the top? We can go over here.
You
You can go that way, pull back a little bit.
Pull back.
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, I see. All right. Let me see if I put it in my hand. I'll come over here to you. Yeah. This is just a standard 3/8 inch detail gouge, but I've cut the heel of the bevel off and made a continuous curve or arc on the bevel of the tool. And I use it for spindle turning, little tiny beads and coves and things like that. And in this case, I use it on the bottom of forms to give a little undercut like I did, or trim off the bottom. But you must ride the bevel. You must start the bevel first. If you go on the edge, it'll kick backwards and you have a beautiful spiral all the way up the outside of your bowl. And But it has great advantages. You can do all the normal stuff with it, it's just you can do more things with it, including doing spindles. But the nice thing is that having taken that heel off, you no longer have the compression lines on the bottom of your form that you have to sand out. And they're deadly because they really push far into the wood. You know, in fact, a lot of the guys who are doing production bowls or open bowls with these gouges, they'll soften with sandpaper this little area right in here on the heel of the bevel so that there isn't a sharp edge on there, because you just end up having to sand it out. And I can certainly appreciate that. I don't do it, but that's because I don't make them very often.